The smoke hung over the desert base like a burial shroud, thick and acrid, carrying the stench of burnt fuel and something worse. Colonel Marcus Brevard stood on the tarmac with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the eastern horizon where the sun should have been. Instead, there was only gray. The radio in the operations tent had gone silent 47 minutes ago, and in that silence 6 aircraft had simply ceased to exist. 6 warthogs. 6 pilots. The morning briefing had been routine, close air support for a ground convoy moving through hostile territory near the Syrian border. Intelligence had called it a low-risk corridor. Intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. Now Brevard waited, his jaw set like granite, while behind him the ground crews stood motionless, their tools hanging useless in their hands. No one spoke. No one moved. They all knew what silence meant in war. Then someone heard it. A sound so faint it could have been imagination, a distant growl threading through the smoke. One of the crew chiefs cocked his head, listening. Another followed. The sound grew, not louder but more present, a guttural mechanical rasp that didn't belong to any jet but to something older, something meaner. Brevard turned his head slightly, not daring to hope. The smoke shifted, and through it came a shape, low, dark, impossibly slow. The A-10 Thunderbolt II materialized like a ghost returning from the dead, trailing black smoke from its starboard engine, the left wing shredded and hanging at an unnatural angle. Hydraulic fluid streaked the fuselage in dark ribbons. The landing gear deployed with a tortured groan, one wheel twisted, the other barely holding. The aircraft didn't so much land as collapse onto the runway, metal shrieking against concrete, sparks fountaining in its wake. For a moment no one moved. Then Brevard was running, his polished boots pounding the tarmac, the ground crews flooding after him. The canopy peeled back with a hiss of pressurized air, and a figure climbed out slowly, methodically, as if every movement had been rehearsed 1,000 times. Captain Natalia Cove pulled off her helmet, and her dark hair fell across shoulders still trembling with adrenaline. Her flight suit was scorched across the left arm, and blood ran from a cut above her eyebrow. She turned to face the colonel, and her eyes, pale green and unnervingly calm, held something none of them had expected to see again. She was alive, and she had brought her aircraft home. 18 hours earlier, Natalia Cove had been the last pilot in the ready room, sitting alone with her back against the wall, methodically checking her gear with the precision of ritual. The others had already filed out, their voices fatting down the corridor, call signs and crude jokes the armor young men wore against fear. She didn't join them. She never did. It wasn't hostility that kept her apart, just a fundamental difference in how she carried the weight. Natalia had flown combat missions over 3 continents in 9 years. She'd survived 2 ejections, 1 crash landing, and a SAM strike that should have killed her over the Hindu Kush. Her call sign was Phantom, not because she was elusive, but because she had a habit of appearing where the enemy thought she couldn't be, and surviving what they were certain would kill her. The younger pilots didn't know what to make of her. She was 34, which made her ancient by fighter pilot standards, and she flew the A-10, which made her a relic by modern doctrine. The Warthog wasn't fast. It wasn't stealthy. It was a flying gun designed in the Cold War to kill Soviet tanks, and in an age of 5th-generation fighters and standoff missiles, it felt like bringing a sledgehammer to a chess match. But Natalia loved the aircraft with a loyalty that bordered on religious. The A-10 was honest. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It absorbed punishment, kept flying, and brought its pilot home. She understood that kind of integrity. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, call sign Razor, had made a joke about her in the briefing, something about Phantom being too old to keep up. The others had laughed, not cruelly, just the reflexive camaraderie of a squadron where everyone took their shots. Natalia had smiled slightly, said nothing, and continued reviewing her kneeboard cards. She'd stopped trying to prove herself years ago. The men who mattered knew what she could do. The ones who didn't would either learn or wash out. Webb was 26, cocky and blessed with the kind of natural stick-and-rudder skill that made flying look effortless. He was also green, with only 14 months in theater. He didn't yet know the difference between confidence and survival. The briefing had been straightforward. 6 aircraft, close air support for a Marine convoy threading through a valley network east of the border. Expected threats: small arms, possible RPGs, low probability of coordinated anti-air. Flight lead was Major Chen Takata, call sign Hawk, a squared-away officer with 200 combat hours and a reputation for running tight formations. Natalia was flying wing on the second element, paired with Captain Jerome Alcott, call sign Smoke. The mission brief lasted 20 minutes. The intelligence officer, a pale young captain who looked like he'd never left the wire, assured them the corridor was clear. Natalia made a note on her card, circling the estimated threat assessment. She'd learned long ago that when intelligence said clear, what they really meant was, we don't know. The sun had been a copper disk on the horizon when they took off, 6 warthogs lifting in pairs, their twin engines howling as they clawed into the sky. Natalia felt the familiar pressure against her chest as the aircraft accelerated, the world dropping away beneath her. She loved this moment, the transition from earth to air, the shedding of gravity's claim. The A-10 wasn't graceful. It was blunt, functional, brutally effective. But when you understood it, when you learned its rhythms and moods, it became an extension of your own body. She trimmed the aircraft, checked her instruments, and settled into formation. The radio chatter was calm. Hawk's voice, level and professional, calling waypoints. Smoke acknowledging. The younger pilots trading occasional comments, their voices tinged with the bravado that came before contact. They crossed into the operational area at 14,000 feet, high enough to stay clear of small arms, low enough to maintain visual contact with the ground. The valley system spread below them like a wound in the earth, jagged ridges casting long shadows in the early light. Natalia scanned the terrain, her eyes moving in the pattern drilled by 1,000 training flights, near to far, clockwise instruments, back to near. The convoy was a string of tan vehicles crawling along a dirt road, their progress agonizingly slow. Everything looked quiet. Everything looked wrong. Hawk's voice came through the radio, calm and measured, calling the initial pass. The formation split into elements and Natalia banked left, following Smoke into a shallow dive. She armed her systems, her thumb resting lightly on the weapon selector. The 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon was the soul of the A-10, a weapon so large the aircraft was essentially built around it. 7 barrels, depleted uranium rounds, capable of shredding armor like paper. She'd fired it in anger more times than she could count, and the sound, a deep, primal roar, still sent a shiver through her every time. Then the world caught fire. The missile came out of nowhere, a streak of white exhaust arcing up from a cluster of rocks on the northern ridge. Natalia saw it for maybe half a second before the radio exploded with warnings. Missile launch, brake left, brake left. Hawk's voice, no longer calm, edged with urgency. Smoke was already moving, throwing his aircraft into a violent turn, flares streaming behind him like silver rain. Natalia broke right, the G-forces slamming her into the seat, her vision narrowing at the edges. The missile tracked past Smoke, lost its lock, detonated somewhere overhead in a blossom of orange fire. But it wasn't alone. The valley erupted with launches, 5, 6, 7 streaks of white cutting through the morning air. This wasn't small arms. This wasn't opportunistic fire. This was a prepared ambush, a coordinated anti-air trap that had been waiting for them. The intelligence officer's face flashed through Natalia's mind for a split second, and then she was fighting, every nerve alive, every instinct firing. She jinked the aircraft, her hands moving in patterns drilled by years of muscle memory, flares dumping automatically, the aircraft bucking and twisting. Another missile screamed past her canopy, close enough that she could see the motor burn. Razor's voice came through the radio, high and tight with adrenaline. I'm hit, then static. Natalia didn't have time to process it. A third missile was tracking her, its seeker head locked on her engine exhaust. She pulled the aircraft into a climb, bleeding speed, the warthog groaning under the stress. At the apex, she kicked the rudder hard, throwing the nose around, diving back toward the deck. The missile overshot, lost energy, fell away. But her right engine was screaming now, temperature gauges spiking into the red. Something had clipped her, shrapnel, a proximity detonation, she didn't know. Black smoke poured from the cowling, and the aircraft shuddered, losing power. "Phantom, you're trailing smoke," Smoke's voice tight with fear. "Get out of there." "Negative," Natalia said, her voice flat, almost conversational. "I'm still flying." She throttled back the damaged engine, nursing the aircraft, her eyes scanning the instruments. Oil pressure dropping, hydraulics fluctuating. The stick felt heavy in her hand, the controls sluggish. But the aircraft was still responding. The A-10 was built to take punishment, designed to keep flying even after catastrophic damage. She'd heard stories of warthogs returning to base with entire sections of wing missing, with engines shot out, with hydraulics failed. If the aircraft believed it could make it home, she would believe it too. The radio was chaos now. Hawk calling targets, trying to regain control of the formation. Someone screaming about a fire. Another voice, unfamiliar, calling Mayday. Natalia forced herself to focus, to compartmentalize. She was still in the fight, she still had ordnance, and the convoy below was still in danger. She rolled the aircraft, searching for the source of the missiles. There, a cluster of buildings on the ridgeline, partially hidden by camouflage netting. She could see movement, figures running, the telltale signature of a launcher being repositioned. She armed the cannon, aligned the pipper, and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared to life, the entire aircraft shuddering as the gun spat 70 rounds per second into the target area. The buildings disintegrated, walls exploding into dust and debris, the camouflage netting shredding like tissue. Secondary explosions blossomed, ammunition cooking off, fuel igniting. She held the trigger for 3 seconds, the longest 3 seconds of her life, and then released. The gun fell silent. The target area was a smoking crater. But her aircraft was dying. The right engine seized with a mechanical shriek, the turbine blades disintegrating, shrapnel punching through the cowling. Fire warning screamed in her headset. The stick went dead in her hand, hydraulics failing, and suddenly she was flying a 20-ton brick with the glide ratio of a refrigerator. She reached for the ejection handle, her hand hovering over it, every instinct screaming at her to pull, to get out, to survive. But something stopped her. Not stubbornness, not pride. A cold calculation. If she ejected here, she'd land in hostile territory, miles from friendly lines. The chances of rescue were minimal. The chances of capture were high, and if she was captured... She looked at the stick in her hand, at the smoke pouring past her canopy, at the ground rushing up below. The convoy was still there, still moving, still depending on air cover, and her squadron was scattered, burning, dying. She made a decision that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with simple arithmetic. She was going to fly this aircraft as long as it would fly, and she was going to kill as many of the enemy as she could before it stopped flying. If she died doing it, that was acceptable. Death was always part of the equation. She switched to manual reversion, bypassing the dead hydraulics, controlling the aircraft through sheer mechanical linkage and trim tabs. It was like flying through molasses, every input delayed, every correction an act of will. But the warthog responded grudgingly, stubbornly. She brought the nose around, searching for targets. There, trucks moving along a secondary road, reinforcements heading toward the convoy. She armed her Maverick missiles, locked the lead vehicle, and fired. The missile streaked away, trailing white smoke, and impacted with a flash of orange fire. The truck exploded, flipping end over end, blocking the road. The radio crackled, Hawk's voice strained. "Phantom, RTB, you're done, get out of here." "Negative," Natalia said again. Her voice was still calm, almost detached, as if she were discussing weather patterns. "I have targets and ordnance." "That's an order, Captain." "Respectfully, sir, I'm still mission capable." She wasn't. They both knew she wasn't, but she also wasn't leaving, not yet. Hawk was silent for a moment. Then quietly, "Copy that, Phantom, watch yourself." She fired her second Maverick at another truck, watched it die. Her left engine was screaming now, temperature gauges pegged, the smell of burning oil seeping into the cockpit. The aircraft was vibrating so violently that her vision blurred and she could taste blood where she'd bitten her lip, but she kept flying. She found another launcher, hidden in a wadi, its crew scrambling to reposition. She brought the gun to bear and fired. The launcher disappeared in a cloud of dust and fire. Then the left engine quit, just stopped, the turbine winding down with a mournful whine. She was flying on momentum now, a glider made of titanium and stubbornness, descending inexorably toward the desert floor. She trimmed the aircraft, trying to stretch every foot of altitude, every second of flight. The convoy was behind her now, moving out of the kill zone. The ambush had failed. The ground forces would survive. Natalia keyed the radio one last time. Her voice was steady, almost serene. Phantom is bingo fuel and hydraulics, going emergency. Phantom eject, Smoke's voice raw with emotion, punch out. She looked at the ejection handle again. Then she looked at the horizon, at the smoke-filled sky at the base somewhere far to the west. The Warthog was still gliding, still responding to her inputs. The aircraft had brought her through hell. It deserved better than to be abandoned in enemy territory, stripped for parts by the people who tried to kill them. She made a decision that defied every regulation, every survival instinct, every rule of engagement. She was going to try to bring it home. She didn't respond to Smoke. She simply flew. The desert stretched below her, endless and indifferent, and she became a single point of focus. Altitude for airspeed, airspeed for distance, distance for survival. The aircraft was a corpse, a shell, but it was her corpse, and she would honor it by flying it until there was nothing left to fly. The stick was dead in her hand, but she had trim tabs. The engines were gone, but she had momentum. The hydraulics were failed, but she had cables and willpower. Miles passed beneath her. The aircraft descended in a slow, agonizing spiral, trading precious altitude for forward progress. She didn't think about the ground. She didn't think about the impact. She thought only about the next second, the next input, the next correction. Flying became meditation, a state of pure presence where nothing existed except her hands on the controls and the aircraft's slow, dying dance through the air. When she finally saw the base through the smoke, it looked like a mirage, something too good to be true. She was at 300 feet, maybe less, the ground screaming past below her. She had no engines, no hydraulics, no radio. It had died somewhere over the last 10 miles. She had only momentum and gravity and the fatting hope that the runway would be clear. She couldn't see the gear indicators, didn't know if the wheels had deployed or if they'd hold. It didn't matter. She was committed now, crossing the threshold of the base perimeter, the runway rising to meet her. The Warthog hit hard. The right gear collapsed immediately, and the aircraft slewed sideways, metal shrieking, sparks fountaining in great arcs. The left wing caught the ground and crumpled, and for a moment Natalia thought the aircraft would cartwheel, disintegrate, kill her in the final seconds after everything she'd survived. But the A-10 held together, sliding, grinding, slowing. It came to rest halfway down the runway, a smoking wreck trailing debris and fuel. Natalia sat in the cockpit for a moment, her hands still on the controls, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Then she methodically began the shutdown procedure, flipping switches on a dead aircraft out of sheer habit, muscle memory, overriding reason. When she climbed out, the world felt strange, too bright, too quiet. She could hear shouting, boots pounding on concrete, but it all seemed distant, underwater. She turned to look at the aircraft, at the wreckage she'd brought home, and felt a wave of grief so profound it nearly buckled her knees. The Warthog had saved her life, and she had killed it bringing it home. The scorched metal, the shredded wings, the engines blown apart. It looked like a fallen warrior, and she felt like she'd betrayed it. Then Brevard was there, his face pale, his eyes wide. "Captain," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "How many made it back?" Natalia met his gaze, and in that moment she knew. She'd been so focused on her own survival, on bringing her aircraft home, that she hadn't heard the other voices fade from the radio one by one. She looked past the colonel, at the empty tarmac, at the ground crews standing silent and waiting. There were no other aircraft, no other pilots climbing out of cockpits, just her, just the wreckage at her feet. "One," she said quietly, "just one." The debriefing lasted 4 hours. Natalia sat in a gray room with fluorescent lights that made everything look dead, facing a panel of officers whose expressions ranged from shock to barely concealed anger. Colonel Brevard sat at the center, his hands folded on the table, his face unreadable. An intelligence major, not the young captain from the briefing, he'd been conspicuously absent, walked them through the timeline, and with each passing minute the scope of the disaster became clearer. The intelligence had been worse than wrong. It had been catastrophically, criminally negligent. The valley was a kill box, a prepared ambush with overlapping fields of fire and advanced surface-to-air systems that shouldn't have been in theater. Someone had fed them bad information, and 5 pilots had died because of it. Natalia recounted her actions in a flat, emotionless voice, sticking to facts, to timelines, to observable data. She described the missile launches, the evasive maneuvers, the loss of her engines. She described her decision to remain in the fight, to engage targets despite her aircraft's condition. She did not mention the moment she'd hovered her hand over the ejection handle. She did not mention the grief. The panel listened in silence, occasionally asking clarifying questions, their pens scratching notes that would become official reports, lessons learned, statistics in a database. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then a JAG officer, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward. "Captain Cove," she said carefully, "you violated direct orders to return to base. You continued to engage enemy targets with a critically damaged aircraft, placing yourself at unnecessary risk. Can you explain this decision?" Natalia looked at her for a moment, weighing her response. She could explain it in terms they'd understand: tactical necessity, force protection, mission accomplishment. She could cite regulations, doctrinal justifications, the mathematics of air support. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. She'd stayed because leaving felt like abandonment. She'd stayed because the convoy needed her. She'd stayed because her squadron was dying, and she refused to let their deaths be meaningless. "The enemy was still engaging our ground forces," she said finally. "I had weapons and a functioning aircraft. I made a tactical decision to continue the mission." "Your aircraft was not functioning," the JAG officer said. "You'd lost an engine and hydraulics. You were minutes from complete system failure." "The aircraft was controllable. I assessed the risk and determined I could still contribute." "You could have been killed." "Yes, ma'am." Natalia's voice didn't waver. "That was always a possibility." JAG officer sat back, her expression troubled. Brevard cleared his throat, drawing attention. "Captain Cove," he said, his voice measured, "your actions today were—" He paused, searching for words. "Extraordinary. You engaged multiple enemy positions under catastrophic conditions, protected friendly forces, and brought your aircraft home against impossible odds. You're also the sole survivor of a massacre that killed 5 of your squadron mates. We need to understand not just what happened, but why." Natalia met his eyes. "Why it happened or why I survived?" "Both." She was silent for a long moment. "We flew into a prepared ambush because our intelligence was wrong. Major Takada, Captain Alcott, Lieutenant Webb, Captain Morrison, and Lieutenant Chen died because someone didn't do their job. I survived because—" she hesitated. "Because the A-10 is built to absorb punishment, and because I was lucky." "Luck," Brevard repeated. "You call it luck." "What else would you call it, sir?" He didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at the other officers, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then he turned back to Natalia. "You're grounded pending investigation. Medical will evaluate you for trauma response. We'll reconvene in 48 hours." He stood, and the others followed. "Dismissed, Captain." Natalia stood, saluted, and walked out of the room on legs that felt like rubber. In the corridor outside, she leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and tried to breathe. The grief was waiting for her now, patient and terrible, and she knew that when she finally let it in, it would destroy her. But not yet. Not here. She pushed off the wall and walked toward the barracks, her boots echoing in the empty hallway. The memorial service was held 3 days later on a clear morning when the sky was the color of steel. 5 empty chairs sat in a row before the assembled squadron, 5 pairs of boots placed precisely, 5 helmets resting on 5 rifles. Natalia stood in formation, her dress uniform pressed and perfect, her face a mask of controlled grief. The chaplain spoke words that were supposed to bring comfort but only emphasized the absence. Names were read, careers summarized, families notified. Each pilot reduced to a paragraph, a statistic, a memory. When it was over, when the formation had dissolved and the others had drifted away in small groups, Natalia remained. She stood before the empty chairs, looking at the boots that would never be filled, the helmets that would never be worn. Lieutenant Webb's helmet still had a faded sticker on the side, some band logo she didn't recognize. Major Takata's boots were worn at the heels, evidence of 1,000 hours in the cockpit. She studied these details, memorizing them, as if by holding onto the small things she could keep the larger absence at bay. "They're saying you're a hero." The voice came from behind her and she turned to find Captain Jerome Alcott, Smoke, standing a few feet away, except it wasn't Smoke. Smoke was dead. She'd heard him die on the radio, his final transmission cutting off mid-word. This was someone else, someone she didn't know, wearing Smoke's face. She blinked and reality reasserted itself. Not Smoke. Captain Marcus Webb, Razor, except that wasn't right either because Razor was dead too. She'd heard his voice, high and frightened, calling that he'd been hit. Her mind was fracturing, overlaying the living and the dead, and she realized with a cold shock that she didn't know who was standing in front of her. "Captain Cove," the voice was concerned now, and the face resolved into someone unfamiliar, a young major she didn't recognize, probably assigned to the investigation team. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said automatically, "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." He stepped closer, his expression genuinely worried. "When's the last time you slept?" She tried to remember and couldn't. Time had become elastic, unreliable. "I don't know." "Come on." He took her gently by the elbow, guiding her away from the memorial, away from the empty chairs and the watching eyes. "Medical needs to clear you before you go back to flight status anyway. Let's get you checked out." She wanted to protest, to insist she was fine, but the words wouldn't come. She let herself be led, and in that moment of surrender she felt the first crack in the armor she'd built around herself. The grief was waiting, patient and inevitable, and soon it would come flooding in. But for now she walked in silence, a ghost among the living, a survivor carrying the weight of the dead. The medical officer was a captain named Rivera, a calm woman with gentle hands who didn't ask stupid questions. She checked Natalia's vitals, shined lights in her eyes, ran her through a battery of cognitive tests. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and regarded Natalia with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and professional concern. "Your physical injuries are minor," she said. "Mild concussion, some bruising, nothing that won't heal. But Captain, you're exhibiting signs of acute stress response. You've experienced a severe trauma, lost your entire squadron, and you haven't processed it yet. Your body is running on adrenaline and shock, and when that wears off, you're going to crash hard." "I'm fine," Natalia said. "You're not fine, and that's okay. No one would be fine after what you went through." Rivera paused. "I'm recommending mandatory psychological evaluation before you return to flight status, and I'm prescribing sleep medication because you need to rest." "I don't need medication." "Captain, I'm not asking." Rivera's voice was firm but not unkind. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion. Take the pills, sleep. Let your mind start to process what happened. This isn't a weakness, it's biology." Natalia wanted to argue, but she was too tired. She took the medication, signed the forms, and walked back to her quarters in a daze. Her room was exactly as she'd left it 3 days ago. Bed made with military precision, gear stowed, nothing out of place. It felt like a museum exhibit, a reconstruction of a life that no longer existed. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding the pill bottle, staring at the wall. She didn't remember taking the medication. She didn't remember lying down. But when she opened her eyes again, it was dark, and her alarm clock read 300. She'd slept for 14 hours and her dreams had been full of fire and falling and voices calling from radios that no longer worked. She sat up slowly, her body aching, her mind clearer but no less heavy. The grief was there now, no longer patient, no longer waiting. It sat on her chest like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. She got up, dressed, and walked outside into the desert night. The base was quiet, most personnel asleep, only the night shift moving through the shadows. She found herself walking toward the flight line, toward the rows of parked aircraft. Most of the warthogs were dark, covered in camouflage netting, their pilots sleeping or dead. But one sat apart from the others, illuminated by work lights, and as she approached, she saw it was hers. The wreckage. The aircraft she'd brought home. A ground crew was working on it despite the hour, and Natalia recognized the chief, Master Sergeant Holloway, a grizzled veteran who'd been maintaining A-10s since before she'd learned to fly. He looked up as she approached, his weathered face creasing in concern. "Captain," he said, "you shouldn't be out here." "Is it salvageable?" she asked, looking at the aircraft. In the harsh work lights, the damage looked even worse than she remembered. The right wing was gone from the inner pylon out, just jagged metal and exposed structure. The engines were charred hulks. The fuselage was pockmarked with shrapnel holes, hundreds of them, and she couldn't understand how the aircraft had stayed in the air. Holloway followed her gaze. "Salvageable?" He let out a long breath. "Ma'am, this bird should be in a museum. I've been working on hogs for 23 years and I've never seen damage like this. The hydraulics are gone. The flight controls are shot. Both engines are destroyed. The fuel system is compromised. The avionics are fried." He paused, looking at her with something like awe. "And you flew it home." "The aircraft flew itself," Natalia said quietly. "I was just along for the ride." "The aircraft was dead, Captain. You brought it home through sheer force of will." He walked over to the fuselage, running his hand along a particularly large hole. "We found shrapnel from 3 different missile types embedded in the structure. You took at least 2 proximity hits and kept flying. The tail section is held together by prayers and duct tape. The fact that you're standing here talking to me is a miracle." Natalia didn't feel like a miracle. She felt like a fraud, a survivor who'd lived while better pilots died. "Can you fix it?" she asked. Holloway looked at her for a long moment. "Why would you want me to?" "Because it deserves to fly again." He studied her face, and whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. "It'll take time. Months, maybe. We'll have to rebuild half the airframe, source new engines, replace every system. But yeah, Captain, if you want it flying again, we'll make it happen." "Thank you, Sergeant." She stayed there for another hour, watching the crew work, listening to the sound of tools on metal, the quiet conversations of men who understood that sometimes fixing broken things was all you could do. When she finally walked back to her quarters, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, and she felt something shift inside her. Not healing, not yet, but perhaps the first small movement toward it. She'd brought the aircraft home. She'd survived. And now she had to figure out what came next. The investigation concluded 8 days later. Natalia was called back to the same gray room, facing the same panel of officers, but something had changed. The anger was gone, replaced by a grim acceptance and something else, something that looked almost like respect. Colonel Brevard opened the proceedings, his voice formal. "Captain Cove, the investigation into the events of October 10th has concluded. I'm authorized to share the following findings." He paused, glancing at his notes. "The intelligence provided for your mission was based on outdated reconnaissance and inadequate signal analysis. The enemy had moved advanced SAM systems into the valley 3 days prior, and this movement was not detected or reported. The intelligence officer responsible has been removed from duty and will face disciplinary action. Additionally, we've confirmed that the ambush was specifically designed to target close air support assets, suggesting the enemy had advanced knowledge of our operational patterns." Natalia listened, her face impassive. So it was worse than negligence. It was predictability. They'd become routine, and the enemy had learned to read them. Brevard continued. Your actions during the engagement have been reviewed extensively. While your decision to disregard direct orders and continue fighting is technically a violation of military protocol, the panel finds that your actions were tactically sound and directly resulted in the survival of the ground convoy. You destroyed 4 high-value targets, neutralized multiple SAM sites, and provided critical suppression that allowed friendly forces to withdraw. Your subsequent emergency landing, while extremely high risk, successfully preserved a valuable airframe and provided maintenance with critical intelligence on enemy weapons capabilities. He looked up from his notes, meeting her eyes. Captain Cove, you're being recommended for the Silver Star. Additionally, your flight status is being restored effective immediately. However, given the psychological trauma of the engagement, you're being offered the option of a stateside assignment with full honors. No one would question that decision. The room was silent. Every eye was on her. Natalia thought about the offer, safety, distance, the chance to walk away from the place where her squadron had died. It was a gift, generously offered, and part of her wanted desperately to take it. But another part, the part that had kept flying when the engines quit, that had brought the broken aircraft home, knew that walking away would be its own kind of death. "Permission to speak freely, sir," she said. Brevard nodded. "Granted. I appreciate the recommendation and the consideration, but I'd like to remain with the squadron. They need experienced pilots and—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Running away won't bring them back. The only thing I can do for them now is make sure their deaths meant something. Make sure we learn. Make sure we don't make the same mistakes." Brevard studied her for a long moment, then he nodded slowly. "Understood, Captain. You'll remain with the 47th. We'll be receiving replacement pilots over the next 2 weeks. You'll be instrumental in bringing them up to speed." He paused. "And Captain, what you did out there, staying in the fight, protecting those Marines, that took courage. Real courage. Don't diminish it." Natalia didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply said, "Thank you, sir." The panel was dismissed, and as Natalia stood to leave, the JAG officer who'd questioned her earlier approached. "Captain," she said quietly, "for what it's worth, I was wrong. What you did wasn't reckless. It was extraordinary. I hope you know that." Natalia nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and walked out into the bright desert sunlight. The weight on her chest hadn't lifted, but it had shifted somehow, becoming bearable. She was alive. She had a mission. And somewhere on the flight line, a broken aircraft was being slowly, painstakingly,